Hi, I'm Allie Jackson-Jolly. I am here with Dr. Stacy Gallin, who is the founder of the Forbes Institute for, let me see if I get it right, Ethics, Human Rights, and the Holocaust. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and so of course I met you right around 2020 when the country was reeling from George Floyd. I met you at the time when you were very deeply involved in your foundation called CARE, which was College Athletes for Respect and Equity, and of which I eventually became a member of that board. And first I would just ask, can you just talk a little bit about why, your expertise is obviously in ethics and the Holocaust, and yet there is this institution that you founded to help college athletes, predominantly Black college athletes, address racism in this country. Can you talk about where you see that overlap?
Sure. So the mission of the Forbes Institute is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to promote justice, tolerance, equality, and human dignity for all people. I think one of the things that people don't really understand about the Holocaust is that it's not an issue about history or religion. The Holocaust did not start with the killing of 6 million Jews. It started with the killing of disabled children, people who were labeled inferior by these systems of power, medicine, law, journalism, who basically created this hierarchy of human life. And that hierarchy of human life is something that we continue to see to this day. We continue to have a problem in society with a lack of ethical leadership. And that is something that's very troubling. So my organization, the Forbes Institute, was founded on the idea that we need to remember the past and protect the future. And the best way to do that is to kind of connect what happened during the Holocaust with current instances of injustice. And so obviously, what took place in 2020, with George Floyd and other instances of, blatant injustice was something that was very concerning. In 2018, our institute, along with Candle's Holocaust Education Center, which was founded by a Holocaust survivor, Eva Moses Kaur, we took the Davidson College basketball team to Auschwitz. None of the students on that team were Jewish, but they had the opportunity to walk through these places with Eva, a survivor who unfortunately has passed away since then, and hear her story and really see what happens when people forget what it means to be ethical, to place human dignity above all else. And they came back from that trip transformed. And all of them, every single member of the team, the coaches, went on to do something, to become ethical leaders, to become change agents. And we took that opportunity, and I continue to work with people on the team, Kellen Grady in particular, who is currently playing basketball in France. And we said, these are leaders of the next generation. These are people who have a platform and can do something. So how can we take that experience, going to Auschwitz, use it as the catalyst for them to affect real change, again, to promote tolerance, equality, and justice on a greater scale. And that's kind of how we came up with the idea for CARE. And that's been the foundation for everything that we do.
Yeah, so talking about ethical leadership and students, to be honest, that's the reason I really wanted to have you in here, because it's disturbing, I think, to see what's happening. It's disturbing to a lot of people to see what's happening on some of the most elite college campuses in terms of students behaving very poorly, and then there seems to be a void of leadership, whether that's students as leaders or in many cases academic leaders, presidents and deans saying, hey, there are certain rules of engagement by which we stand by, right? And so because I know of the work that you do, it's never about silencing somebody from having an opinion within boundaries, right? I think, as a Black American, bigotry, blatant bigotry should never be allowed. But there can be conversations. And it's been astounding to many people that there's no leadership to fill this void, to help students understand how to have a conversation with someone who may not agree with you, but who may learn something, and you may learn something from them. Can you talk to me about why you think there's such lack of leadership on these campuses, and why we continue to see, just abhorrent behavior by students?
Yeah. So we are we're in trouble right now. Ethically speaking, I would say we're in trouble because we are lacking people who are willing to stand up and speak out when injustice is present. Full stop. There are certain things, obviously, I've spoken about this with many people. There are certain things, I think, that fall into a morally gray area. Obviously, dealing with ethics, bioethics, medical ethics. There are a lot of things where you can have a conversation and there are differing sides and things like that. But there are certain things that I think everyone should be able to kind of get behind and understand. The kidnapping of children, murdering babies, things like that. These are things that we should all understand are wrong. And we should be able to stand up and speak out against these things. There's a lot of different factors that go into what I believe kind of is this moral vacuum that we're currently in. There's a fear, right? There's a fear of backlash that comes because I think people are conflating the situation, the political situation that has been going on in Israel for quite some time with the terrorist attack that took place on October 7th. These are two separate things. You can disagree with Israeli politics, right? That's okay. You can disagree with that and you can still condemn the terrorist attacks. You can still condemn taking over 200 people hostage, raping women, cutting pregnant women open, parading around with dead bodies, chanting, for the execution and genocide of a people. Those two things exist separately. And I think one of the main problems right now is the conflation of the political situation, which again has been going on for quite some time, and this very blatant terrorist attack. To me, that's a big issue.
Yeah, so let's talk about conflating issues. And again, I want to get back to what good leadership would look like, how we can create good leaders and thinkers, that are going to Columbia, Cornell, UPenn, these places that we know have been in the news recently. But about the conflation of issues, talk to me about the fact that, or explain to me, I haven't seen much conversation anywhere on the news, at college campuses around differentiating being in support of Israel or opposed to Israel acts right now, and not being anti-Semitic, right? So I would imagine that if we had a Venn diagram, there are some people who are anti-Israel who are also anti-Semitic. But I imagine that there are also people who are not supporting Israel but do not feel they are anti-Semitic. Should there be more a place to have more conversation about that so that we can help students specifically understand that being for a state or against a state, particularly, I think about this, Israel is not an extension of the United States. They have been a very important ally, and they may be an extension of home for many Jewish people, but as Americans, Israel is not an extension. Should there be more of that conversation, or do you think that's dangerous?
First and foremost, there needs to be a condemnation of terrorist acts in the same way that we would condemn terrorist acts that take place anywhere. I think that, to me, is the issue, is it shouldn't be treated differently because it's happening in Israel, right? As I said, the politics should be secondary right now. Whatever anybody's issue is with the politics, the terrorist attacks that are occurring should be called out for what they are, and they need to be called out for what they are. And that is the number one priority from a humanitarian, human rights perspective. That's here. I think that one of the main issues that we have is there's a lack of understanding and a lack of education. And particularly for students, I think students are kind of like, get caught up in whatever the latest social justice movement is. And they're like, okay, yes, but there's also this other stuff going on. And so I almost think that they don't know what social justice movement to get behind. Well, do we get behind condemning terrorists, or do we get behind, these other issues that have been happening in Israel? I think, first of all, there's a time and a place. I don't think when people are, again, the atrocities that we know are happening right now, I think there's a time and a place. I don't think this is it. However, as you said before, I'm not one to silence people's voices. I think the issue in higher education has been for quite some time. Higher education is supposed to be a place where you can have a respectful discussion about difficult ideas, right? We all come from whatever little bubble we grew up in, and then we go to college and we meet people from different backgrounds, from different ethnic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and that's supposed to enhance our learning. We're supposed to be able to hear other sides that we may not previously have known. And professors, we're supposed to be the adults in the room. We're supposed to be the ones that encourage these conversations, but again, in a respectful way. Create safe spaces for people to have conversations, because I think there's a lot of fear. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? Will I all of a sudden, be immediately labeled as anti-Semitic, as racist, as, all of these different things? If we can't provide that for students, then they're relying on other sources. And those other sources, as a journalist, unbiased journalism is a very difficult thing to come across right now, particularly now if you're adding social media into the mix. So who is providing the education for these students? We've seen this. Obviously, we know these students want to be active agents of change, right? And this is, what we do now. CARE has kind of morphed into Athletes Against Antisemitism and Discrimination. We know that athletes want to follow in the footsteps of professional athletes and use their platform, but they don't know how. It's our job, it's our responsibility to give them the education, the skills, the tools that they need to do it in the right way. And what we're seeing right now is just kind of this free-for-all where people are not understanding. They're like, well, we have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment allows us to say whatever we want. Well, that's not really true, because you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You have to understand the consequences of your speech and your actions. So I think that there's a lot of things that are happening right now, and we need to understand them and prioritize them. First and foremost, there are crimes against humanity that are taking place. We need to condemn them wherever we see them. It's like, we've been saying for quite some time, stand up and speak out when injustice is happening. Silence is complicity. So to me, that takes precedence. The second thing is we need to make sure that we are keeping students on American college campuses safe. The fact that there are students who cannot go and eat in kosher dining halls because there are threats for their safety, they're being barricaded in libraries or rooms, this should not happen. Our students should not have to fear for their safety. We need to figure out how to prevent that. But on a much, I think, greater scale in terms of the future of what does ethical leadership look like? What is this going to mean for our society? We need to be creating these safe spaces for these conversations to take place. We can't wait until there's a crisis or a catastrophe, because then people forget the rules of civil society. And that's where we are.
Right. And so that's a good point, understanding the time to have these conversations. But when the time comes, I think a lot about how the next generation, I'm not even going to say college students, think about very complex, sometimes raw topics. And, there's a lot of thought leadership right now, which shows that not only students, frankly, but our society as a whole has a hard time having conversations with people who don't agree with them. It's easier sometimes to get angry or to yell over social media than to have a deep and thoughtful conversation. And yet, I also think about how personal these conversations are. So this reminds me a little bit of 2020 and George Floyd, where it was very hard for many Americans, many Black and brown Americans who were directly impacted by the police misconduct and murder that had happened, to then have a conversation with someone in the police force who, about police officers who wanted to who wanted to be a part of community or wanted police safety, right? And so it's very interesting to think about being able to think both things when in a moment when you're so close to it, right? So police reform is needed, and there are police officers who are protecting society, right? So with respect to what's happening on college campuses now, perhaps I do want to march for the people of the Gaza Strip, and I do condemn the atrocities of Hamas. And so can you talk to me about what you think? You're a professor, you teach ethics both here in the U.S. and abroad to international populations. What does that kind of leadership education look like that helps to create the future leaders who can talk about very complex topics that are very uncomfortable, that they may not agree with, but do it in a way that moves society forward and at least brings us closer together as opposed to dividing us all?
So I think the key word what you said there was and, right? It doesn't need to be an either or. And I think we live in a very polarized society where everything is either or. You can't fall anywhere in the middle, right? There's no room for a middle ground. And that's unfortunate because, as I said, when you deal in ethics, oftentimes many things fall in a gray area. So there's a few things. The first is, I do think, again, I go back and I repeat this, and I do, in many ways, I think it mirrors what you're saying about, George Floyd. There's a time for people to grieve and to mourn and to be upset, and that needs to be understood. Certain types of protesting right now are going to hit Jewish Americans very, very much to our core. There's been signs. There was a sign in Turkey that said "No Jews allowed" in front of a store. I mean, I can tell you personally, the emotional just sensation when I see something like that, having, relatives that died in the Holocaust and all these things. I mean, that is frightening to me. That is shocking. That hits me, as I said, in my core. So it is difficult, even for somebody like me who is trained to have conversations. It's hard when you see things like that happening. And I don't think that we can ignore that. That's not something that can be ignored. We're not robots, we're humans, right? We have emotions, we have feelings. So again, going back to kind of this idea of priorities, I think there's a time and a place to be able to have certain conversations, and I think there needs to be an understanding, and I think there needs to be a little bit of empathy in our world in general. Empathy is important. It's important to understand what someone's going through. It's just a simple text message from a friend of mine saying, "Hey, are you okay? I know this must be a difficult time for you, and I just want to let you know I'm thinking about you." Things like that are important, and I think that they contribute to a better society in general. But again, there needs to be education. education is so important because, again, we're living in a world where the next generation gets their information from sources that aren't always accurate. And social media is a dangerous thing because you can go on social media and you can espouse things that aren't true. There's very little ability to fact check. And, you know, as the adults in the room, it is our responsibility to be able to curate these conversations. So what I would really like to see happen, particularly on college campuses, is, you know, some type of programs like, yes, they have these DEI departments, but what are the DEI departments doing? What are they actually doing? Are they enabling training programs for not just professors, but people who are running residence halls, you know, student life, things like that? Where are these programs? Because we need to have these programs. We need to be able to create safe spaces for students to be able to have these kinds of conversations. I think that is key. We need to be able to stress, first and foremost, that the dignity of the individual needs to be respected. That should be, and I've always said this, the purpose of higher education. It should be the purpose, forget higher education. We should be stressing this at younger ages as well. When I talk about the lessons of the Holocaust, I will change the way that I'm talking about it depending on the age. So sometimes if I'm talking about it, you know, with a group of fourth graders, the conversation will be, if you see people bullying somebody, stand up and speak out, because that's an injustice. And you need to stand up and speak out and not allow that to happen. There's a range of different things that can happen, but if we are truly concerned about the next generation, then we need to make sure that there's an understanding that all humans deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. However, that means that we have a responsibility to treat all people with dignity and respect. And if we can ingrain that in the next generation, if we can use the lessons of the past, compare them in certain ways to what's happening now, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's George Floyd, an understanding, again, of, you know, the complexities of the human situation, but the understanding that there's more that unites us than divides us, then we will at least have a starting point to be able to have these conversations. Maybe there needs to be a mandatory course for all students where we're talking about things like this, led by a trained professional. Maybe we need to be investing our dollars in this. Maybe this is something that we need to think about really, really seriously in all of our educational programs. Because I think, you know, the idea of a safe space for education is so key. And while we're focusing on, again, right now, keeping our students safe and, you know, doing all of these other things in the moment, we also need to be thinking ahead. We also need to be thinking about how we can kind of, you know, start these programs that are going to shape the future and create moral leaders, create ethical leaders and change makers to ensure that when we say never again this time, we actually mean it and we actually follow through on that promise.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I'm out of time. We're out of time. But I love that idea that, you know, there are people thinking about what the next generation of ethical leaders are. So thank you for coming and telling us a little bit about how we could be addressing that. And, you know, I hope to do this with you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.